Dakota Territory, October in 1888. The air had a familiar, menacing bite. It was the kind of cold that promised worse to come, a brittle warning carried on a wind that swept down from the north with nothing to stop it for 1,000 miles. Most men were shoring up their cabins, chinking logs with mud and moss, banking earth against their foundations. They were splitting the last of their wood, stacking it high against the walls, creating a fortress of fuel for the long siege ahead. But Klaus Richter was on his roof. His neighbors watched him from a distance, leaning on their axes, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They saw the German immigrant wrestling with a long, black length of stovepipe. It was an awkward, ungainly thing, and what he was doing with it made no sense. Instead of running the pipe straight up from his cast-iron stove, creating the short, clean exit that every settler knew was right, he had done something bizarre. He had run it up 3 feet, then elbowed it 90 degrees. Now he was guiding the rest of the pipe horizontally, running it the entire length of his small cabin, just below the peak of his roof. It looked like a great black metal snake slithering through his home. It was wrong. It was foolish. It was, as one man muttered to another at the trading post, an open invitation to disaster. They had a name for it within a week. They called it Richter's Serpent. It was a joke told over lukewarm coffee, a cautionary tale of a newcomer who didn't understand the brutal physics of a Dakota winter. He was building a fire trap, they said. He was going to choke his family on smoke, they whispered. He was a fool, but Klaus Richter kept working, his face impassive, his movements deliberate. He ignored the stares and the murmurs. He was preparing not for a winter, but for a war. What did this quiet immigrant with his strange ideas and calloused hands understand about heat and survival that every experienced builder and frontiersman in the territory had missed? The answer would be written not in words, but in degrees of temperature, in cords of wood, and in the lives of those who huddled through the coming darkness. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because the story of this simple pipe holds a powerful lesson in forgotten physics that is more relevant today than ever. To understand the genius of Richter's Serpent, you must first understand the enemy. The enemy was not merely the cold, it was the theft of heat. Winter in the Dakota Territory was not a season, it was an occupying force. It arrived in November and did not relinquish its grip until April. Temperatures of 20 and 30 below zero were not anomalies, they were the baseline. Blizzards could rage for days, erasing the world in a blinding whiteness and burying cabins to their eaves. In this environment, a man's wealth was not measured in land or cattle. It was measured in his woodpile. A family's entire year revolved around the acquisition of fuel. Spring was for felling trees. Summer was for hauling, splitting, and stacking. Autumn was a final, frantic push before the first snows. A cord of dry, seasoned oak was a unit of life. A family might burn through 10, 15, even 20 cords in a single winter. The standard cabin of the time was a marvel of frontier ingenuity, but it was a thermal sieve. Built of logs, with moss and mud for chinking, it fought the wind but did little to hold on to warmth. The single-pane glass windows were portals for the cold. Frost would paint delicate, cruel ferns on the inside of the panes, then creep down the walls. A rime of ice would form on sleeping blankets from the moisture of a person's breath. Ink would freeze solid in its wells. Water left in a bucket overnight would be a solid block by morning. Life was lived in a small, shrinking circle around the pot-bellied stove, and the stove itself, the very heart of the home, was a deeply flawed savior. It was the epicenter of a paradox. To generate life-giving heat, it had to consume wood at a terrifying rate, and the very mechanism that allowed it to burn also guaranteed its inefficiency. Conventional wisdom, backed by generations of experience, dictated that a stovepipe must go straight up. A strong vertical draft was essential. This column of rising hot air created a powerful suction, pulling fresh oxygen into the firebox, which made the fire burn hotter and cleaner. A good draft prevented smoke and deadly gases from leaking into the room, but that powerful draft was also a thief. It pulled the fire's hot exhaust gases, gases that were still hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit, out of the cabin with violent speed. A man could stand outside and hold his hand a foot from the top of his chimney and feel a blast of heat. That was his woodpile, his summer of sweat and labor, escaping into the uncaring sky. The settlers accepted this as an unavoidable cost. They compensated with volume. If the stove was inefficient, you simply fed it more wood. You built a bigger fire. You worked harder in the summer. It was the only way they knew. Klaus Richter knew another way. He was not a frontiersman. He was not a carpenter. In Germany, he had worked for a company that designed and built industrial brick kilns and smelting furnaces. In that world, fuel was not just a resource. It was a carefully calculated expense. Efficiency was not a luxury. It was the margin between profit and bankruptcy. The engineers he worked with would spend months designing systems of baffles, heat exchangers, and long, winding exhaust flues for a single purpose: to strip every last calorie of usable energy from the hot gases before they were vented. To them, a short, straight flue was not just inefficient, it was professional malpractice. It was like throwing away a third of your payroll every week. When Klaus built his cabin, he saw not a home, but a small, inefficient furnace. And when he looked at his woodpile, the product of his first Dakota summer, he saw a finite supply of life. He knew that what the community accepted as wisdom was, in fact, a tradition of waste. He would not participate in it. His family's survival depended on it. His plan was simple, born of industrial logic. The hot exhaust gas from his stove was a river of energy. He refused to let that river flow straight out of his house. He was going to make it take the long way. He was going to build a dam. The build began in late September. It became a local spectacle. Klaus purchased 12 extra feet of heavy-gauge 6-inch stovepipe from the trading post in Bismarck, a purchase that raised the storekeeper's eyebrows. He assembled his tools with a quiet precision that was characteristic of everything he did. He was not a fast worker, but he was a meticulous one. Every action was preceded by thought and measurement. First, he installed the stove, a sturdy cast-iron box, placing it on a bed of flat stones near the center of his single-room cabin. This was normal. Then came the heresy. He ran the first 3-foot section of pipe vertically, as anyone would. But at the top, instead of continuing through the roof, he attached a 90-degree elbow. The pipe now pointed horizontally, aimed at the far gable end of the cabin. He attached the next section, and the next. He connected 4 3-foot sections in total, creating a 12-foot horizontal run that spanned nearly the entire length of the room. He supported this long pipe with heavy iron straps he had forged himself, bolting them securely to the ceiling joists. Finally, at the far end of the cabin, he attached another elbow, pointing up, and ran a short vertical section out through a carefully cut and shielded hole in the gable wall. He finished it with a small cap to keep out the rain and snow. The community's most respected builder, Elias Vance, stopped by one afternoon. Vance was a man whose opinion carried the weight of experience. He had built more than half the structures in the county. His barns withstood windstorms, and his houses were known for being tight. He was a good man, practical and direct. He watched Klaus tighten the last iron strap, his brow furrowed in genuine concern. He was not there to mock, but to warn. "Klaus," he said, his voice even, I don't mean to tell you your business, but that pipe is going to cause you trouble. Klaus paused, wiping his hands on a rag. He nodded for Vance to continue. A fire needs to draw, Vance explained, pointing a thick finger at the horizontal pipe. Heat rises. It wants to go straight up. By laying that pipe flat, you're going to fight the stove's own nature. Your draft will be weak. The fire will smolder, and the cabin will fill with smoke. He took a step closer, his expression growing more serious. Worse than that is the creosote. The smoke is going to cool as it travels down that long pipe. All the tar and soot will turn back into a liquid and stick to the inside. You're building a fuse, man. One hot fire and that whole pipe will go up in flames right under your roof. You have a wife and children in here. Klaus listened patiently, his eyes never leaving Vance's. The arguments were logical. They were sound. They were based on a lifetime of observation of standard chimneys. They were also, in his view, incomplete. When Vance finished, Klaus offered a simple, quiet reply. The pipe is not flat. It rises 1 inch for every 3 feet of run. Vance squinted, looking at the long pipe again. He hadn't noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible incline. It wasn't enough, he thought. Not nearly enough to overcome 12 feet of horizontal drag. It will be all right, Klaus said, his voice calm and final. It will keep my family warm. Vance shook his head, a look of pity on his face. He had tried. He left, convinced he would be helping rebuild this cabin before the spring thaw. The mockery at the trading post grew louder after Vance's visit. The story was embellished. Richter's Serpent, they called it. The name stuck. Men would tap their foreheads when his name was mentioned. The women worried for his wife, Anya, and their 2 small children. They saw a man whose stubborn pride was endangering his family. Klaus remained impervious. He understood the physics in a way they could not. He had not built a chimney, he had built a radiator, a heat exchanger. In a standard setup, the only significant source of radiant heat was the stove itself. The stovepipe, passing quickly through the room, radiated some heat, but its contribution was minimal. The vast majority of the thermal energy, the superheated gases, was simply ejected from the home. Klaus's horizontal pipe changed that equation completely. He had effectively increased the surface area of his stove by 400%. That 12-foot length of 6-inch pipe had a surface area of nearly 19 square feet. Every square inch of that metal was now inside his cabin, exposed to the air. As the hot exhaust gases traveled slowly down its length, the pipe would heat up to hundreds of degrees. It would then radiate the thermal energy downward and outward into the living space. It would create a massive ceiling-mounted radiator that warmed everything below it: the floor, the furniture, the people. The slow journey would also cool the gases significantly. By the time they exited the cabin, they would have surrendered a huge portion of their heat. He was harvesting the energy that his neighbors were throwing away. He had addressed their concerns in his design. The slight upward slope, combined with the initial vertical kick from the stove, would maintain a sufficient, if slower, draft. He wagered that the stove's heat would be enough to keep the entire pipe above the condensation point of creosote, preventing dangerous buildup. He planned to clean it regularly as a precaution. He had done the calculations. He had trusted the principles he learned in the furnace rooms of Germany. Now, all that was left was the test. And the Dakota winter was about to provide the most brutal test imaginable. December arrived with a vengeance. The first blizzard of the season was a 3-day monster that dropped 2 feet of snow and sent temperatures plummeting. The settlers hunkered down, feeding their hungry stoves, and pronounced the weather seasonable. But in the second week of January, a new kind of cold descended. The old-timers called it a Siberian Express. It was not a storm, but a pure, crystalline mass of Arctic air, dense and heavy and utterly unforgiving. The temperature at dawn on the first day was 10 degrees below zero. By sunset, it was 25 below. The mercury in the thermometers seemed to shrink in fear. By the second day, it was 35 below zero. A profound, unnatural silence fell over the territory. The air was so cold, it hurt to breathe. Exposed skin would freeze in less than a minute. Trees groaned and cracked in the forest, their sap freezing and expanding with explosive force. It was a cold that defeated conventional defenses. In cabins across the territory, the same desperate battle was being fought. Families huddled together, wrapped in every blanket they owned. They lived in an orbit of a few feet around their stoves, which glowed a dull, cherry red. The stoves demanded to be fed every hour, day and night. The sound of an axe splitting frozen wood in the pre-dawn darkness was the sound of survival. Wood piles that had looked immense in October were now shrinking with terrifying speed. The cold found its way inside. It coated the north walls with a layer of shimmering frost. It crept across the floors, killing any warmth that strayed too far from the fire. It made the simple act of sleeping a gamble with hypothermia. In his sturdy, well-built home, Elias Vance was fighting a losing war. He was a man who took pride in his work, but his craft was no match for this level of cold. He had one of the tightest-built cabins in the region, yet the internal temperature away from the stove was barely above freezing. His wife and children were permanently camped by the hearth. They ate there. They slept there. He watched his woodpile dwindle, doing the grim math in his head. The cold snap was forecast to last another 2 days. He wasn't sure if his wood would hold out. He found himself thinking of Klaus Richter. He pictured the German's family, huddled around a smoldering, smoky stove, the cabin filled with poisonous fumes from the choked-back fire. He imagined the interior of that long, black pipe being coated with a thick, flammable layer of creosote, a disaster waiting to happen. A part of him, the part that was a prideful expert, felt a grim satisfaction, but a larger part of him, the part that was a decent man and a neighbor, felt a growing unease. What if the German's foolishness had finally caught up to him? What if his family was in real danger, freezing or suffocating in that experimental death trap he had built? The thought gnawed at him. By the third afternoon, with the outside temperature holding at a steady 38 below zero, he could stand it no longer. He had to know. He had to see for himself. The journey to the Richter cabin was only a few hundred yards, but it was a voyage across an alien planet. The air was a physical assault. Each breath was like inhaling shards of glass. The snow under his boots did not crunch. It shrieked, a high-pitched, crystalline sound unique to extreme cold. He bundled himself in wool and canvas until he was a shapeless mound, leaving only a small slit for his eyes. His eyelashes began to freeze together with each blink. He pulled his sled, loaded with a bundle of emergency firewood and some blankets. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he came prepared for the worst. As he approached the small cabin, he looked for the signs he expected to see. He looked for smoke puffing weakly from the strange side chimney, a sign of a poor draft. He saw none. He saw no smoke at all. Which was even more worrying. A fire that wasn't smoking in this cold was a fire that wasn't burning. He braced himself for a grim discovery. He imagined finding the family frozen, or worse. He felt a pang of guilt. Had he done enough to warn the man? Should he have been more forceful? He reached the door, his heart heavy. He knocked, his gloved fist making a dull thud. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, shouting Klaus's name. He heard a scuffling sound inside, and then the wooden latch was drawn. The door swung inward, and Elias Vance was hit by a solid wall of heat. It was not the scorching, localized heat of a stove, but a deep, pervasive warmth that filled the entire space. It was like stepping from the Arctic into a summer afternoon. The air was warm on his face, in his lungs. It was shocking, a physical impossibility that his mind struggled to process. He stood there, dumbfounded, his eyes adjusting to the light. The scene before him was one of utter, unbelievable domestic tranquility. Klaus Richter stood by the door, wearing a simple wool shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He was not huddled. He was not shivering. He looked comfortable. Beyond him on the floor, his two small children were playing. They were barefoot on a wooden floor, with the temperature outside nearly 40 below zero. Vance stared at their feet, unable to comprehend the sight. In the corner, Klaus's wife, Anya, was kneading dough on a flour-dusted table. Steam rose from a kettle on the stove. There was no frost on the windows. There was no ice on the walls. The air smelled of baking bread and warm wood, not smoke. Vance's gaze was drawn upward, to the cause of all the mockery, the serpent. The long, black stovepipe ran the length of the ceiling, and it radiated a gentle, steady heat downwards. He could feel it on the top of his head. It was like standing under a benign sun. He stepped inside, pulling the door shut against the brutal world he had just left. He slowly began to unwrap the layers of his outdoor clothing, his movements clumsy with astonishment. "Klaus," he began, but his voice trailed off. He didn't know what to say. He walked slowly into the center of the room, turning in a slow circle. He was an expert builder, a man who understood the dynamics of a cabin more than anyone. His senses were telling him that everything he knew was wrong. He ran his bare hand along the north wall, the wall that in his own cabin was a sheet of ice. Richter's wall was cool, but it was dry and well above freezing. It was just a wall. He approached the stove. The fire within was small, lazy. A few logs burned with a slow, steady pulse. It was not the raging inferno he maintained in his own home. It was a banked, controlled fire. He looked at the wood box next to the stove. It was nearly full. This was the detail that finally broke through his disbelief. The small fire. The full wood box. It defied all logic. He turned to Klaus, who had been watching him with a quiet, knowing patience. "How?" Vance asked. It was the only word he could find. Klaus gestured to the pipe above them. "The heat stays in the house. It does not run away up the chimney." Vance needed numbers. He needed data to make sense of the miracle he was witnessing. He saw a thermometer hanging on the wall, far from the stove. He walked over to it. The mercury stood at 68 degrees. 68 degrees. In his own home, 3 feet from his roaring stove, it was barely 50. "What is your temperature outside?" Klaus asked gently. 38 below when I left my cabin," Vance said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Maybe colder now." A temperature differential of over 100 degrees. It was an engineering feat that should not be possible in a simple log cabin. He turned back to the wood box. "How much wood have you burned today?" Klaus shrugged. 6 logs, maybe 7. The fire keeps itself through the night." 7 logs. Vance had burned more than 30. He was burning through his woodpile 4 to 5 times faster than Richter, and his family was still freezing. The numbers were undeniable. The proof was all around him, in the warm air, on the clear windows, in the bare feet of the children. He looked at Klaus Richter, not as a fool, but as a genius. He saw a man who had not been stubborn, but brilliant. A man who had faced the same enemy, but had used superior tactics. Vance, a man known for his pride and the certainty of his opinions, felt a wave of humility wash over him. He had not just been mistaken. He had been profoundly, fundamentally, and publicly wrong. He walked over to Klaus, looked him directly in the eye, and spoke the hardest and most necessary words of his life. "Klaus," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong. I was completely wrong. This is the warmest house in the territory. You must teach me how you did this. You must teach us all." When the great cold snap finally broke, the story of what Elias Vance had seen in the Richter cabin spread like a wildfire. It was a story told first with disbelief, then with curiosity, and finally with a desperate, urgent need to understand. Vance, true to his word, became Klaus Richter's greatest advocate. His conversion lent the idea an instant, unassailable credibility. If Elias Vance said it worked, then it worked. The mockery surrounding Richter's Serpent vanished overnight. Men began to visit the Richter cabin, not to stare, but to learn. Klaus, a man of few words, would simply point at the components of the system and explain the logic. The long pipe, the slight incline, the iron straps, the clean-out port he had installed near the elbow. He never gloated. He never once said, "I told you so." He simply shared what he knew, answering questions with quiet patience, as if the solution were the most obvious thing in the world. That spring, a revolution in heating began in the small community. Led by Elias Vance, who now understood the principles as well as Klaus, settlers began retrofitting their cabins. The trading post in Bismarck sold out its entire stock of 6-inch stovepipe in a month. Vance helped his neighbors install the systems, adding his own carpentry skills to ensure the pipes were safely supported and the wall pass-throughs were properly insulated with tin and rock wool. He called it the Richter Heat Exchanger. The name Serpent was never used again. The following winter was the true test of the legacy. It was another cold one, but the character of the community had changed. The frantic, desperate edge of survival was gone. Families burned half the wood they had the previous year. Their homes were not just survivable, they were comfortable. Children could play on the floor without fear of the cold. Walls remained free of frost. The endless, back-breaking labor of feeding the stove was reduced to a manageable chore. The impact was more than just physical comfort. It was a change in the psychology of the frontier. The winter was no longer an enemy to be endured, but a season to be lived in. The Richter stove, as it came to be known, freed up time and energy. Men could spend more time tending to livestock or repairing gear. Women were not tethered to the hearth. It gave them security. A smaller woodpile was required for the same amount of warmth, meaning a bad year for cutting wood was no longer a potential death sentence. The innovation provided a margin of safety that had never existed before. Klaus Richter never sought fame or fortune for his idea. He remained a quiet farmer, content with the safety and warmth of his own family. But his contribution was woven into the fabric of the region. New cabins were built with the horizontal flue as a standard feature. His simple, elegant application of forgotten physics had fundamentally altered the lives of everyone around him. The real impact wasn't measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in the quiet moments of dignity the warmth provided. A family eating dinner at a table instead of huddled on the hearth, a mother reading a book to her children in a comfortable room, an old man able to sleep through the night without fear of the fire going out. It was the gift of home. The story of Klaus Richter is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas are not complex inventions, but simple, elegant reapplications of basic principles. It speaks to the conflict between entrenched tradition and empirical evidence. The settlers were not foolish for clinging to their vertical chimneys. They were following a system that had worked, however imperfectly, for generations. Their mistake was not in their knowledge, but in their certainty. They allowed their experience to close their minds to a new possibility, dismissing it as folly because it looked wrong. Klaus Richter, the outsider, was free from this prison of tradition. His background gave him a different lens through which to see the problem. He saw not a stove, but a thermal engine. He saw not smoke, but wasted energy. His solution was born from a refusal to accept the inefficiencies that everyone else had normalized. This principle of maximizing heat transfer by increasing the surface area and residence time of hot gases is not just a historical curiosity. It is a cornerstone of modern engineering. It is the fundamental idea behind industrial heat exchangers, high-efficiency furnaces, and regenerative thermal oxidizers used in factories around the world. Klaus Richter had, in his own small way, built a rudimentary version of the technologies that now power our modern lives. If this story made you think differently about the simple act of staying warm, hit that like button to help spread this piece of forgotten wisdom. And subscribe for more stories of practical genius from the pages of history. Let me know in the comments, what's the most clever, low-tech solution to a problem you've ever seen? This narrative is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering principles of heat exchange and flue gas radiation are real and historically significant, the characters, specific events, and locations depicted are products of creative storytelling. This content is based on historical concepts, but does not represent a specific, documented historical event. It should not be taken as professional engineering or construction advice.